Okay, bingo, 4 o'clock rock. But it isn't 4 o'clock in New York or Washington, wherever you guys are. Jason Disterhoft and Alison Kirsch of the Rainforest Action Network. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having us.
What time is it?
It's 7 o'clock here in San Francisco.
Okay, well, that's not too bad. Yeah, we did a show with Amanda from Rainforest Action Network, I guess earlier this year. She was covering things in Paris at the COP21 talks. That was very interesting to talk with her. Come to find, you guys are pretty active, and I'm quoting out of your, I guess, your press release language. You run hard-hitting campaigns to break North America's fossil fuels addiction. You protect endangered forests and indigenous rights. You stop destructive investments around the world through education, grassroots organizing, nonviolent direct action. And you're at ran.org, which is great. And we want to talk to you today because we got an email about a report that you described, the 7th Annual Bank Finance Report Card. And the news is that it revealed major banks are pouring hundreds of billions into extreme fossil fuels. Can you give us the background of this report? How does this report get written? How long has it been going on? And what kinds of things does it describe?
Sure. So for 6 years now, Rainforest Action Network has been doing exactly what you described, Jay, which is grading some of the biggest private sector banks in the world on their practices and policies in funding fossil fuels. And in particular, in the past few years, we've been looking at coal, because coal is the most environmentally destructive and the highest greenhouse gas polluting of the fossil fuels. However, things really changed back in December in Paris at the UN climate talks, when 195 plus nations came together and agreed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And governments admitted that climate change was real and really decided that they were going to move forward on that. So we had to raise the stakes for banks. It's no longer just about coal. We really need to push banks to be thinking about more fossil fuel investments, including the investments in the most extreme subsectors of the oil and gas.
Well, I would have thought that after COP21, with all these lofty statements, grand statements of aspirational, ideas, that governments would have done something. And I recall there was an issue about the language. I guess John Kerry took out the word must and put in the word can or could. Was normative language rather than obligatory language in the final agreement. This raises the question about whether the governments involved, signatory or not, are actually obligated by the document to do something. And if they are obligated by the document to do something, then they can tell the banks what to do. They can tell the banks not to invest, for example, in fossil fuels. They can tell them by statute or executive order or something. By agency product, agency action, but that hasn't happened, right?
So we think the 1.5 degree target coming out of COP21 is an important achievement, and one that came from the bottom up. It was really island nations in Paris that led the charge. Their slogan was 1.5 to stay alive. And for them, that's just an existential truth. A lot of these countries will simply cease to exist if business as usual, as far as climate change goes, continues unabated. So the 1.5 degree target was a real achievement, but just as that was bottom up, just as that came from people around the world, holding our governments to that standard is up to all of us. Those of us in the nonprofit sector, most importantly, activists on the ground throughout the country and around the world. COP21 was a real achievement, but it's really up to all of us to make sure that that the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement actually come true. So this report that we launched today is one piece of that puzzle, setting out a concrete next step for banks to take and take urgently.
Okay, the banks are not obligated, though, not to invest in fossil fuels. And I guess what I hear you saying is that Rainforest Action Network and others, including BankTrack, Sierra Club, Oil Change International, are looking into what the banks are doing with the idea of educating the public and the government to try to get the government, or for that matter, the banks themselves, to voluntarily withdraw their funding of fossil fuel capital investments, yeah? So the one thing that I noticed in the press release was that there has been, in fact, a reduction in investment in coal. Just as Alison said, that's the hot button one. That's the one that's most destructive, and the banks have done something about that. Is that because they want to protect the environment or respect the result of COP21, or is it for other reasons?
I can start. The main so there are a number of banks in the last year or so that have made commitments to reduce their exposure to coal mining year on year, meaning they're committing to fund coal mining less and less with each successive year. In our view, that is a relatively minimal commitment. It's progress, but a lot more needs to happen, and a lot more needs to happen very quickly. Most of those commitments, starting with Bank of America last April, and following on a number of 5 of the 6 biggest U.S. banks in total, came sort of in the lead up to COP21, under pressure from civil society, and using COP21 as a real deadline for banks to commit to get out of coal. Through bottom-up action, we were able to win a number of commitments from U.S. and European banks.
So
one thing that I would
what happens, Jason, Allison? What happens? Do you pick up the phone and call Bank of America and say, "Hi, can you please reduce your investment in carbon fuels and especially coal"? How does that work? I mean, aside from issuing press reports, reports of this nature, and press releases, do you pick up the phone and call the CEO?
Our strategy is pretty broad and wide-reaching and really gets at the bank from a number of different angles. So one primary strategy that we have is that we really bring this issue to light, and that's through reports such as these, through other media articles that basically show the bank's investment in these fossil fuels, in coal in particular, to use the Bank of America example. We really use media leverage to show and sort of shame the bank on how their investments, because we're essentially heating up our climate, as well as threatening communities in Appalachia where mountains are literally blasted to pieces to mine coal. So that's one tactic we use. A second is that we really hit the banks on their home turf. We had activists showing up in Charlotte, North Carolina, where Bank of America is headquartered, protesting at the bank's annual shareholder meeting, showing up at recruitment events that the bank was holding to bring on new employees. And in general, one other really important action actually was dropping a banner at the Bank of America Stadium in Charlotte, which we rebranded as the Bank of Coal Stadium. So that's
that
really
got their attention, I'm sure.
It did. It absolutely did, and it got the media's attention as well. So we hit them on their home turf. And then the last tactic that was really important in our Bank of America campaign, which I sort of mentioned earlier, is that we make sure to bring in the voices of the people who are most impacted by Bank of America's investments in coal. So For Bank of America, that was the involvement of a lot of people in Appalachia whose homes and communities, whose waterways and air that they breathe are threatened daily by coal mining operations particularly with mountaintop removal coal mining, which Bank of America was highly involved in. And at the time when we started our Bank of America campaign, Bank of America was the #1 coal banker and diametrically opposed to Rand's position that the bank move in any other direction other than forward on coal. And just a few short years later, the bank became the first major global bank to publicly declare it would reduce its investment on coal mining. So our strategy is broad-reaching, but we've certainly proven it to work.
Well, that's great. You've had a significant effect then, if that's so. But let me ask, when you talk to the Bank of America, whether you talk to them by calling the CEO or by dropping a banner, either way, do you say, look, we know that you're financing X dollars or X percent of the capital investment in these coal companies, and we want you to reduce that to X minus or X and a half in order to, comply with, the COP21 standard or otherwise. I mean, do you actually negotiate how much they have, how much they should have, or do you just ask them, reduce in general, reduce until, we all feel better? I mean, is it qualitative or quantitative?
Well, our ultimate goal is to get these coal investments to zero. That's the bottom line. At the end of the day, the gold standard is an exclusion policy from the bank. So the bank saying, for example, to use the coal example, the gold standard would be a bank saying, we commit to no longer from this day forward finance any companies that are involved in coal mining, coal-fired power. You can even get into coal transportation infrastructure and other things like that. And so the quantitative answer is that we want that to get down to zero. When we engage with the banks, we find that we're often able to negotiate, as Jason said, around these year-on-year policies that are reductions over time. And while that is something, we really haven't seen the true leadership that a bank could show by saying right here, right now, we are no longer going to finance coal, extreme oil, or extreme gas going forward.
Well, let me ask you this. I'm just thinking logically about, the effect of all of this. Seems to me if I'm a coal company and I can't get my money from one of the banks, the 25 banks listed in the report, I'll go to another source because in order to survive as a business, I may need some kind of rotating capital. And if I can't get it from, say, Bank of America, I'll just go somewhere else. Can't they do that? Do they do that? Is that what happens when Bank of America or one of the others withdraws its capital investment or declines further capital investment in these coal companies, for example? Don't they go somewhere else, some other country, some other bank that has the money and wants to make an investment in the U.S.?
So in fact, we've seen with the recent bankruptcies in the coal industry that a lack of capital from big banks really is hurting a number of coal producers, including the biggest ones like Arch and Alpha, and literally driving them bankrupt. So cutting off funding from the biggest banks is one of a number of factors, but it is a major factor in driving in accelerating the decline of the coal industry.
Yeah.
And moving us towards the post-carbon economy.
Yeah. P.S. The conviction of that coal executive recently, I want to say Kentucky, that probably has an effect too. I don't think banks like to invest in a company like that. Dangerous business. Banks have social responsibilities even if they don't admit it freely. But the other thing is, if you do successfully take away all the capital investment, say from the coal industry, it will fail. I mean, I guess that's important. But do you want it to fail and stop that business and cost all those jobs? I mean, how do you feel on that side of the balance?
Well, to be clear, the coal industry was already in a decline for many of the reasons that RAND really amplifies, including the fact that people who are affected by coal operations in their backyards are no longer are willing to take that and are standing up for the coal industry. So there's more and more of a social risk that comes with coal mining or creating coal-fired power, especially in America. It's become a pretty toxified industry and was really in financial distress for a long time. So some of RAND's policies that we've achieved in major banks reflect that status of the coal industry. And that's part of the argument we're making with this new report, is that not only are these new subsectors that we've included in the report beyond coal, for example, Arctic oil, tar sand oil, ultra deep water drilled oil, and liquefied natural gas, not only are they becoming more socially risky because they have such high human impact, but they're also financially risky. So that's one of the key arguments we're making in the report, and also why we're able to move banks on some of these issues. As to the jobs question, we certainly support healthy and clean and safe jobs for everyone. And unfortunately, that's not what we find in the coal industry. And that was really demonstrated by Don Massey's trial, the coal executive you mentioned who was sentenced to a year in jail, is that he's putting his workers under extremely unsafe working conditions that resulted in a mine explosion that killed 29 people, I believe.
Yes.
And so those are the kind of jobs we want for the communities that happen to be sited in resource-heavy places. And moving toward a clean economy future, we can find the jobs that don't put people's lives at risk.
Okay, great answer, great discussion. We take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about whether this action encourages in some way, causes the banks to invest in renewables instead. We'll be right back.
You're watching ThinkTech Hawaii, offering lifelong learning from passionate hosts and fascinating guests, ready to explore and explain Hawaii's
Jason,
place
can
in
you
the
scoot
21st
in?
century. Great content for Hawaii from ThinkTech.
Hi, I'm Ray Starling, and I am co-host for Hawaii's Wednesday afternoon State of Clean Energy. And with me today is Leslie Cole Brooks, and she's going to tell you what's happening this month with our shows.
Hi, everybody. I'm Leslie Cole Brooks, the Executive Director of the Distributed Energy Resources Council. And this month's focus is on distributed energy resources. We just had a great show on smart grid technologies, and the rest of the month we're going to discuss storage, different strategies, microgrids, and then we're going to have live man and woman on the street from Verge. So it's really exciting, very informative, lively, and just worth doing. So see you next Wednesday.
We're back, we're live. We're here with Jason Disterhoft and Alison Kirsch of Rainforest Action Network. They join us by Skype from San Francisco, which is your headquarters, isn't it? Yeah. Great. You know, if I had another life to lead, I would come and join you guys. Work for free, all that. Yeah, doing good work. Good for you. So we all like renewable energy, okay? We all want that. We want it really bad. We want it really bad in Hawaii, you know, but it's transforming the society, and transforming any society, and especially the business end of it, where the money is counted, is hard. It's hard to do that. And these big banks, you know, they are into big money. They're into satisfying their stockholders. They're into making a return on everything they do. And so does this mean that they will not invest that money in energy at all? Or are you finding, and I don't know if the report covered this, but the money that they withdraw from coal and other fossil fuels is reinvested in renewables? Is that what's happening? Is that a good bet for them? Do they do that?
I mean, so the first thing to say about continued fossil fuel investment in fossil fuel, sort of business as usual, is that it crowds out investment in renewables, and a necessary step to building a renewable economy with steady and sustainable funding from all sources, private and public, is going to be reducing the influence of the fossil fuel industry and diverting capital away from fossil fuels. So building a truly renewable economy, you know, a necessary step is taking down the pillars of the fossil fuel economy. And the work that we're doing is one piece of that puzzle.
Well, when you call the CEO of Bank of America, and asked him if he'd, get off fossil fuels, especially coal. Do you also mention to him, it would be a really good idea if you invested in renewables, how about some solar or wind or geothermal, what have you? Is that part of the conversation, or are you just interested in stopping him from investing in fossil fuels?
Many of these banks, and you'll see this in their public relations, many of these banks really do realize the immense potential that is the renewable energy industry. And that's why in a lot of banks' responses to RAND communications, they'll say, well, in this year, we've put this many millions of dollars into renewable energy. What this report really focuses on is that the amount of capital that in the past few years that has gone into the dirtiest fossil fuel energy subsectors is really still immense. And we can have that renewable conversation, but the ending fossil fuel finance conversation is really, really urgent, because when you invest in, for example, a new coal-fired power plant, that plant has a life cycle assumed to be 50 years long. So building that now is not just a decision that's affecting our energy supply now, but one that's affecting our energy supply up to 50 years in the future, when our world will be a totally different place. So we really focus on that conversation and highlighting the urgency of that message for our planet now and for our planet in the future.
Alison, you mentioned a little while ago that one of the tools in your arsenal was to go to a stockholders meeting and buy a few shares of stock if necessary, what have you, and attend the meeting and tell the board of directors, what the issues are and advocate for COP21 and so forth. But what about the stockholders themselves? I mean, they're the real capital force. Not only are they the real capital force, but they theoretically control the board of directors. I mean, are you also talking to them to say, don't buy this stock, sell this stock, drive the price down of this company? Let's force this company to change its conduct, impact investing all around, not just loans, but equity. Are you into that too?
I mean, one thing that we do or have done in the last few years is kind of show up in force at annual shareholder meetings for some of these big banks. Bank of America, for example. In 2012, we had 1,000 people protesting outside their shareholder meeting in North Carolina, and that's been paired in recent years with working with shareholder activist groups to introduce resolutions around things like pushing the banks to publish and be transparent about the amount of carbon emissions that they're financing through their sort of whole portfolio of investments. And that kind of activism is really only growing. Just in the last year in the fossil fuel industry proper. You've seen some really impressive work at the shareholder meetings of some of the oil majors, Shell, among others, with really fired up activist groups calling on these companies to decarbonize, and again to kind of move to become energy companies and not just fossil fuel companies.
Yes.
And the numbers there, these are resolutions that are really sending a strong signal to the leadership of these companies, and the numbers there in terms of the votes that they're getting are really quite impressive. So not only in the financial industry but also in the fossil fuel industry, you're seeing sort of a resurgence of shareholder activism in the last few years.
So, I mean, would you say, for example, to the investment community, or I should say the investor community, the moms and pops who own a few shares of a utility company, the moms and pops that own a few shares of an oil company, would you say, why don't you guys say something, either by your feet, by walking away from that investment, selling your stock, or by communicating with the organization and the board? I mean, are you reaching the individual investments or investment managers? For example, here in Hawaii, we have a lot of people are interested in impact investing. We have some, wealth management guys who actually do that. And I wonder, how ubiquitous that is, if it's ubiquitous at all, and whether you guys, Rainforest Action Network, are trying to talk to the individual investors or the consultants and stockbrokers, what have you, who can recommend or not a company based on its use of fossil fuel.
Rainforest Action Network's primary strategy is essentially to have the bank itself divest from these companies. And that's a strategy that works in parallel to what you're describing, to individual investors deciding that they don't want their money in these companies that are essentially cooking our climate. Those strategies work in parallel, and they're not mutually exclusive. But what we really focus on is demonstrating to the banks that the investment portfolios that they're holding and that they're continuing to invest in, both in the financial support they give to companies through loans as well as through equity, that financial support is incompatible with a climate stable world. Mm-hmm. It simply is. Mm-hmm. And that's why this report is called Shorting the Climate. We are demonstrating, and we have demonstrated with this report, that banks are essentially betting on climate failure, because the only way that they can truly make money off of these investments is if we don't follow through on agreements made in Paris, if civil society doesn't hold their governments accountable to true action on climate. So what we're really focusing on is highlighting that discrepancy, that hypocrisy at the portfolio level in the bank, so that the bank itself divests from these companies.
Okay. Your report says these banks have sunk $42 billion into companies active in coal mining, $154 billion for the 20 largest coal-fired power producers, $306 billion for companies that drill extreme oil, $282 billion for companies building liquefied natural gas export infrastructure. So I guess you're going to do another report next year. I guess that's as sure as we're sitting here together. And are you going to be, tracking the amount of that investment, up, down, sideways, whatever, in order to meet a goal, to see if you can actually get it down? And how far down do you want it to go? Is there a chart out there somewhere about how far down it's come and how far down, your target is?
So we will be keeping track. We do issue a report card every year, and unfortunately, it looks like we're going to have to continue to do that for the next few years to come. Especially with these new coal mining commitments of big banks, promising to reduce their exposure to coal mining, we will be keeping track and calling banks out when if they fail to meet those commitments.
Yeah, suppose they do really well. Suppose they get an A on the report card. If they really listen to you and listen to COP21 and do it voluntarily, do you send them candies or chocolates or flowers maybe? What do you do when they get an A? Huh?
Well, we've yet to see any bank show enough leadership to get an A, and that's another somewhat sobering conclusion of the report, that the highest grades were in coal mining because of these recent coal mining commitments, but they still averaged out to a C.
Okay.
Which, if you get report cards in school right now, is not a great grade.
No, it's not a great.
It's not a great grade. So we'd like to see the grades go up, particularly in extreme oil and liquefied natural gas. Those are the sectors where the banks have the fewest thoroughly developed public policies available, saying, for example, that they will take these certain considerations under account when reviewing a possible transaction with an extreme oil company, or, getting better and better would be saying that they won't finance these sort of projects or that they won't finance these sort of companies. And so that's a really good way that we can track bank progress year on year, is see where their grades lie, and their grades are a reflection of what their policies are within the bank as to what they will and won't finance. And again, I'll just reiterate what I said before, that this report card is a call to these 25 U.S., Canadian, and European banks to get out of these sectors. So that means the financing numbers eventually we would like to see at zero.
And just to say, we see the question of whether or not they get out of these sectors. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. I mean, again, call us optimists, but we think the world is going to successfully tackle climate change, and investment in coal and extreme oil and liquefied natural gas export is simply incompatible with even a 2-degree world, let alone a 1.5-degree world.
Well, thank you very much, Jason. We're out of time. Jason Disterhoft and Alison Kirsch, you guys are great. Thank you very much for appearing on ThinkTech Global, talking about banks betting on climate change. So interesting. I hope we can connect up with you again soon. Thank you very much, and aloha.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks, Jay.